This past week has seen some terrible things unfolding on the national news. I just about come to the conclusion that I wasn't going to watch the news much anymore because it seemed to all be conflicting messages about how to handle this pandemic. We were getting uh, news reports from one source that said this is what we should do, and from another source saying this is what we should do, and nobody seemed to agree, and nobody seemed to have all the information. So it's kind of depressing, and I was just tuning most of it all out. And then news broke this past week about the death of an unarmed black man named George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And like most news reports we've been getting the last few weeks, I'm sure that we don't have all the information. Even yet, we don't. But more and more information is coming out as we watch all this unfold. And the most disturbing part of the entire story is the rioting that's been taking place in the last few days because of what happened. It's going on in the name of protesting, and yet it's been more violence and crime that's happening in cities across the country. Senseless destruction and violence are the pictures that flood our television and our cell phones from places far and wide, far removed from Minneapolis. And I understand the message that peaceful protesters are trying to get across, that racism in any form whatsoever needs to be eradicated. It needs to be taken out of our hearts and our minds, the people of all races, not whites, not blacks, but all of us. God created us to be one race, the human race, and we should love and care for one another and not hate someone simply because their skin is a different color than ours. The devil is sure taking advantage of this situation and trying to get us to destroy each other, and we need to do all we can to make sure that he's not successful. And if that means we need to reach across the aisle to people of different races, then we need to get busy doing that. But there's two things that stand out in all this that I wanted to make mention of particularly this morning. I want to share just now. And they involve the women of the two main characters involved in this story. George Floyd, the black man who was killed, and Derek Chauvin, the police officer who's been in the videos with his knee on George's neck. Now, I don't have any intention of trying to lay guilt on anyone because, as I said, all the information isn't out yet, and I'm not in a place to make that decision. And I'm sure we're going to find out more. But what I find most interesting is the contrasting responses from each of these men's wives, or fiancée in one case. Derek Chauvin's wife, that's the police officer's wife, just announced that she's filing for divorce. She's so upset by what's happened that she sees irreconcilable differences, and as in most divorce cases, I'm sure there's some animosity there, and she sees her husband as a liability and a burden around her neck, and she just wants to be rid of him. But George Floyd's fiancée has come out on record pleading for peace. She said this: "You can't fight fire with fire. Everything just burns." She says that if George were still able to respond to what's happened, he would still give grace. Franklin Graham called today on all churches across the country to make Sunday as a day of prayer for our country. And we need to pray for all the George Floyds out there who've been mistreated at the hands of others. But we also need to pray for those who've allowed hatred and racism to taint their hearts and their behavior towards others. We need to pray that this country can find peace before we tear ourselves apart. And the only way that's going to happen is if we find it through Jesus Christ. When Jesus was being crucified and terribly mistreated by those he came to save, he said this, he said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And he urges us as his disciples to learn to turn the other cheek for the sake of the gospel and the sake of his love. And that's the only way that this world will ever be changed. So as we share the emblems of the Lord's Supper this morning, I want you to pray that God uses you to be a change agent in this world today. And may the loaf and the cup remind you of just how much he was willing to pay to make that happen. I'm not going to voice a prayer now because I want you to pray for your heart and for your life and for your influence in the church. Amen.